Hello, I'm Greg Johnson, Director of the Walter H. Capps Center for the Study of Ethics, Religion, and Public Life here at UCSB, and it's a real honor to welcome you all. Thanks for giving up part of your afternoon to be here with us, to learn with us. I want to thank especially our guests, whom I will introduce momentarily, but let me just say up front, it's really great to have you all here. And they are part of a 20-person group who are here for 2 days to think with us about repatriation at UCSB and ways forward into the future, and ways that connect with other related issues, including land protection and care, and cultural education, and religion and law for Indigenous peoples generally in these trying times. Okay, so that's the broader context of how we're here. And we wanted to make sure to have a public element to what we're doing, because it would be remiss, frankly, to bring such a esteemed group to campus and not give them a chance to share thoughts and for us to learn from them. So thank you. I want to point out a few upcoming events at the Capps Center. In November, we have 2 great events. November 12th, we have Kamana Beamer. He's a political scientist and cultural theorist from Hawaii, and he'll be speaking about the importance of water in Hawaii. And as elsewhere in Hawaii, water is life. And he'll tell us about how that is ancestrally so, and why that continues to matter into the present, and then what that story can tell us about the rest of us, because water is precarious, and our relationship to it will define a way forward, to be sure. The very next day, the Capps Center, in conjunction with Arts and Lectures, is sponsoring poet Martin Espada from Puerto Rico. And he's super intense. He calls it like it is, about suffering, about place, about dispossession. It's a little bit outside the norm for Arts and Lectures programming. And they've taken a risk on this, frankly. And we can show them that was a good risk by showing up and appreciating it. So come out for that poet, please. At this juncture, before I move on, I want to turn it over to my colleague and friend, Christina Gonzalez, who also happens to be the chair of the UCSB Repatriation Committee, a valued Chumash colleague, Coastal Chumash Band, who will welcome us into this space.
Haku Chichichantike Kikikich, Christina Gonzalez Kakti, Aknicho. Welcome to this place. Welcome to the Western Shores over here that we call Santa Barbara today, right? But I'd like to welcome you to this area, welcome you to this land, and I ask you to please share with us in this space and as we move forward in this great conversation and this discussion that we're having. So welcome to our land here. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Fantastic. Okay, a few thank yous. Again, to the MCC for opening up this space for us. It's such a wonderful space, and it's air conditioned. Who knew that would matter in late October? So we're glad for that. And MCC brings a community with it, and to be able to tap into that and the student energy that the MCC represents is a gift to us at the Capps Center. So thank you for that. I want to thank the Associate Director of the Capps Center, Dusty Hosley, who makes so much of this work happen. Please give Dusty Hosley a round of applause. I want to acknowledge the Henry Luce Foundation. With their support, we're able to do this work, not just today's presentation, but the general workshop and one last February that some of you learned about, and hopefully work going forward in this context. So representative of the foundation, Jonathan Van Antwerpen, is here. So thank you, Jonathan, for this work. Also, an invitation immediately after tonight's event will end by 5:30 for sure. There's a reception immediately next door in the MCC lounge with food and drink. Please hang out, meet folks. Like I said, there are 20-some scholars and community members here. So stick around and chat with us and help us learn from you. So we'd really welcome that. Okay, so our topic tonight in the broadest sense is Indigenous traditions and law in the current political moment. That's fraught, that's huge, that's more than we're actually going to be able to tackle reasonably in an hour, but it sets a frame, right? We all know that this is a challenging political moment where most everything we care about is being challenged in all kinds of ways. Native peoples have felt this in spades for centuries, if not millennia, right? In different ways. it's acutely felt now, so we're posing questions of this moment, but they're questions that cut deep into history. So let's be attentive to that. It's not just about the current moment alone. Within that frame, the principal consideration here in front of us is repatriation. That means the return of ancestors from institutions back to their home communities and their objects, sacred objects and others. But the way we're framing it here also pertains to larger issues of land protection and care, cultural education, and so forth. So some of the speakers will talk about repatriation in the more narrow sense and others in a more capacious sense. We invite you into the conversation after they speak to probe us, to probe questions along these lines, whether in a narrow sense or in a more broad sense. So please join us in that. I want to say right now that UCSB has turned a corner on this work. There have been certain news reports and others that might suggest otherwise. And those of you who know me know I'd be the first to call out an institution if I felt like it should be called out. I think in this context, the work's being done. It's not all the way done. It needs to keep being done. It needs to be funded. But for the last several years, largely thanks to our Chumash partners on our repatriation committee, the work's getting done. Ancestors are in fact going home. And that's a story that needs to be told. In fact, it got told today in a news release through UCSB, so look for that. And I want to acknowledge some of the leaders at UCSB who have made this happen. Vice Chancellor Gary McPherson, repatriation leader Hugh Rad, and others in the room. So thank you for steering us in the right direction on this work, guys. The fact that we're beginning to succeed in this area, like I said, doesn't mean it's over. It means we have so much to do, but it also creates an opportunity. If we can establish best practices in this frame, then we can stand proudly on that foundation and say, what else might be done? How might we model best practices for other communities? How might we extend those practices to other issues, land stewardship, and so forth? So that's part of the inspiration here. Because of course, thinking about ancestors is already to think about sacred places, cultural health, and so forth. This effort is only possible in conjunction with our Indigenous partners, of course. And we are grateful that several of them have agreed to join us and speak today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce our speakers all right up front. Then they'll each have 10 to 12 minutes to share thoughts with you. Then we'll open it up to Q&A, and then after that runs its course, we'll convene to the reception and continue to converse in that space. A note on the order. There are a lot of ways to organize a presentation. We're going to do it geographically, and the speakers may or may not hold to that, but that's how I've chosen to organize it. We're going to start from coastal Chumash perspective and move outwards all the way to Oceania. Okay. So, going across the stage here, I want to first introduce again Cristina Gonzalez. She's a member of the Coastal Band of the Chumash Nation, registrar of the Santa Rosa Rancheria Tachiyoca tribe, a member of the California Indian Basket Weavers Board, and a lecturer in American Indian Studies at CSU Fresno. And I've gotten to know her in the context of the repatriation committee here at UCSB, where she is our chair, our fearless chair. And she's helped guide us through difficult conversations, always in a good way, and just making sure the work gets done. So thank you for that, Cristina. Next, I'd like to introduce Amra Solomon. Amra is an assistant professor of English here at UCSB. One of our own, right on. Gotta love that. She is a multilingual writer and artist whose work has been published and exhibited in the US, Mexico, and in the UK. Her current book project, Confluences, Indigenous Border Fugitivity, maps histories of Indigenous flight and refusal against pressures from colonialism and carcerality in Yuma, Arizona. Dr. Solomon is a descendant of the historical O'odham and Yomeg communities in the lower Colorado River region. Amra is a member of the Walter Capps Center board, and so it's in that context that I've really gotten to know her, and I appreciate your support in the programming we do. Thank you. Walter Echo. Apologies. Thank you. Walter Echohawk is past president of the Pawnee Nation Business Council from 2020 to 2023. He is an author, attorney, jurist, and legal scholar. He was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2023. For all of us nerds, that means a lot. He authored, get ready, The Sea of Grass, In the Light of Justice, In the Courts of the Conqueror, and Battlefields and Burial Grounds. Among other current roles, he serves as the chair of the board of directors of the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums. As a staff attorney of the Native American Rights Fund from 1973 to 2009, he represented Indian tribes, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians on significant legal issues in the modern era of federal Indian law during the rise of modern Indian nations in the tribal sovereignty movement. He litigated Indigenous rights pertaining to religious freedom, prisoner rights, water rights, treaty rights, and burial and repatriation contexts. Echohawk is admitted to practice law before the U.S. Supreme Court, Oklahoma Supreme Court, Court of Appeals for the 8th, 9th, 10th, and District of Columbia circuits, and the Federal Claims Court, and several U.S. district courts. Please welcome President Walter Echohawk. And last but not least, Vicente Diaz is a professor of Native American and Indigenous Studies at UCLA, a neighbor to the south if you didn't know of them. He is Pohnpeian Filipino from Guam and an interdisciplinary scholar who has held tenured positions in departments of history, anthropology, American Indian Studies, ethnic studies, and American studies at institutions ranging from small regional universities in Micronesia to large public universities in the US. His work is primarily situated in the emergent field of critical and comparative Indigenous studies in North America and the Pacific Ocean region, and focuses on topics such as Indigenous canoe culture revitalization, sports and indigeneity, traditional outrigger canoe voyaging in Micronesia, colonialism and Indigenous Christianity in Micronesia, Pacific history, film, and video. I met Vicente some years ago at the NISA meetings, and I was a really junior scholar at the time and a bit out of place, and he was really generous with his welcome at that time, and it's really great to be able to reconnect and welcome you into this space here. So thank you for being here. Okay, and with that, you've heard enough from me. I'm eager now to turn it over to our guests, and they're just going to go through their presentations, and like I said, then we'll open it up to Q&A. So thank you for being here.
So first and foremost, I'd like to say thank you to Greg, thank you to the campus, the CAP Center, for this wonderful discussion that we're having. For this wonderful discussion, and I'm so honored to be up here with such amazing individuals that have done some extraordinary things for Native people. So one of the things that I really want to talk about is Native people and their connection to the land. And I think a lot of times, sometimes we lose sight of where we are and what place we're occupying. Because today, we're here on Chumash territory, and Native people around the world have a connection and a spiritual connection to their environment and to their land. And it's not just the land, it's the soil, it's the plants, it's the animals, and it is all of these things that also are a big part of our culture, and they make Indigenous people who they are. And I talk about this connection to the land because when we're talking about repatriation and we're talking about the return of our ancestors for reburial, we do not have a ceremony for reburial. There is what's been done was already done for these individuals already. So we don't have a ceremony for this. But not only that, we are also looking for locations sometimes to put these individuals in the closest location of where they came from. So we're also looking at land. Some of this land is, of course, unceded land. This is land that was stolen. This is land that was taken from us. And not only taken from us, but also have disconnected us from that connection to that land. And having access to that land is very important, not only for the reburial of our ancestors, but for the future of our people also, to have that access. So in our quest for repatriation and reburials, we also need to think in terms of the safety of these ancestors. Will they be disturbed again? Can they be safe from the original pot hunters, right, that dug them up in the first place? But when we're also thinking about land, it's also the health of this land. So it's got, there's so many layers. I feel like we're onions here. There's so many layers because everything is connected, right? You have people. You too are connected to here. You know when the mail comes. You know when the trash comes. You know where your favorite grocery stores are. We all have our connections to this land. Native people have a more, of course, deeper understanding of this land, but we all have a connection. We all have a relationship to this place that we belong in. But when we're considering the spiritual health of the land, you know, where we want to bring our ancestors back and where we want to repatriate and where we want to rebury, that is an important topic because you're asking Native people, you're working with Native people and you're asking them, hey, so let's rebury these people. You can rebury them now. And you have people that sometimes don't have some of that connection to certain parts of that land is not there anymore. You also have the health of that land. Maybe there was lots of agriculture. So where I currently live is in Visalia, and I live in the Central Valley, and we have lots of farming. We have lots of farming, and we have lots of agriculture, and we have lots of pesticides, and we have lots of runoff. And so, you know, when we're thinking of the health and that spiritual health of land, you know, are we going to put our ancestors in the pesticide-infected land that is now here too? Not only that, but this land that we're forgetting. It's a silent participant because we've lost sometimes we have that disconnection from that land. But our relationship to that land, sometimes it's hard to deal with. And so as Native people, we struggle a lot of times, not only with reburial, not only with repatriation, not only with our disconnection and how do we access the land and the spiritual health of the land and the spiritual health of us. But if we're having this own conversation amongst ourselves and amongst our people, other people definitely don't know what we're dealing with. Other people don't know what we're going through. Other people don't have any understanding of what we have. And they have no understanding of us. And I think for me, that's also the hard part, right? So when tribes are working with agencies, they're working with museums, they're working with different institutions, a lot of times they don't know who Native people are. They have sometimes no idea, but they know they have to work with us because that's part of complying with the law. That's part of that consultation process, is working with us. But they don't know who we are. They don't understand our connection to the land. And obviously they do not understand that there has to be a whole new process developed by Native people to reinter these ancestors. And how do we get allies? How do we get people to understand where we're coming from? How do we get people to understand our spiritual connection to this land that has been kind of used and abused? Right? How do we get people to understand this? And I think I might have mentioned this in February's panel, but it's with students, right? It's with students, and it's with like ethnic studies requirements. It is with making people understand that there are Native people. And guess what? There's also other people too. There's African Americans, Asian Americans, these are two-spirited people. There's all these people that we all share space with. Right? So how do we respect each other? How do we create space, right, on this unceded land? How do Native people increase their allyship? How do we find young students who are willing to empathize with us and understand that we do have a special connection to the land and to our traditional places? And that also makes me think of, again, the future of repatriation, and how does the future of even some of this repatriation work looks when we're talking about land, when we're talking about that spiritual connection also. And to me, it's not just the return of the ancestors, not just the return of their things. It's the return of those photographs that were taken out in the field. It's the return of those photographs of those objects. It's the digital repatriation of those items in those places, because in a way, those items, those digital items, also hold place for our ancestors. And so, to me, when we're looking forward, also is that digital repatriation and that understanding, creating that understanding amongst ourselves and amongst the people that we work with. One thing to remember is a lot of our Indigenous people, we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors. A lot of times, we're coming up with new ceremonies for those ceremonies that were asleep and that we don't remember. And we're trying to figure this out. And we can use friends, of course, in our journey for this. But also creating that understanding amongst our allies and creating that understanding amongst people that we live with, right? Because not only are you living here, but you're also my neighbors, right? So how do we also develop that mutual respect and mutual understanding? But as far as the repatriation, like the digital repatriation of some of these items, and working with the United States and with our federal laws and some of our state laws, and making those, bringing those policies to fruition and making repatriation happen. And even on a greater scale, when we're talking about international repatriation, and, for the United States, we need to lead by example, lead by that mutual respect, lead by, by doing repatriation, so that when, Native people are seeking our ancestors in other countries that have been, right, as one of our colleagues has said, they've been stolen and we are doing some rescue work, right, or hostage negotiations. And to bring these people home, that there's an example set by the United States and their repatriation efforts also. So I keep looking at the time because I can keep talking, and sometimes I want to make sure I leave time for my people up here. But again, I'm really saying a lot because there's a lot of things that I really want to say, and a lot of these things are really connected. When I'm talking about the Native people, the land, the digital repatriation, that mutual respect, and this sharing of space that we have, it's really loaded. There's a lot of things. There's a lot of moving parts when we're thinking of friendships and we're thinking of relationships. There's a lot of moving parts. So we can't necessarily focus on one thing because all of these other things are moving at the same time too. And so that is why I would like to thank you for coming, because this is the first step in understanding Native people and understanding repatriation and understanding the plight that Native people face and the future that we see, and also our relationship with this land. So Kaki Nadine, thank you so much for your time. And again, I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
I'm going to open my notes here. Hello, my name is Amra Salamon, and I teach in the English department here at UCSB. And I come from, my father's ancestral community is from the border of California and Arizona, from the area around Yuma, Arizona, and Winter Haven, California. And we are the most western part of O'odham-Jillet, which is the O'odham homelands. And so we're related to O'odham Nation, Gila River, Achin, Salt River, as well as the O'odham in Sonora. So we are crossed by the U.S.-Mexico border, as well as California and Arizona. And our community is the only group on this side of the border that is not federally recognized. And so, sorry, I'm gonna just have to scoot closer. I'll do that, thank you. And so most of my research is looking at this question of why was our community not federally recognized? And it's a very complicated story. It's taken me years to investigate, but we did, basically the Bureau of Indian Affairs wanted to relocate us to the Colorado River Tribes Reservation. We were all enrolled over there, and then they decided, no, we want that water for California, and they terminated all of us. And so as I started to dig into the archival history of that story, I needed to basically develop an archival methodology. And I'm in a literature department, so I come to this question through poetry. And I found this poem by Deborah Miranda, who's Chumash and Esalen, that's called, I'll pull it up here, When My Body is the Archive. And she's writing about the ways that knowledge is extracted from Indigenous peoples, how our bodies are literally put in these institutions as archival materials, but also what is the positionality of the Indigenous descendant when we go into the archive, when we start looking at not only our material culture, but also our historical culture. And there's one line that she says, when my body is the archive, my stories belong to someone else. And I started there, and I created a course around this. It's my archival methods course. I'll teach it in the spring if students are interested, called Body as Archive, where I started to look at this theme of the body in the archive across Miranda's work, across James Luna's work, particularly his piece around Ishi in the archive, and this film, Bontac Eulogy, about Philippine indigenous ancestors that were put into the Smithsonian. And then I also dug into Saidiya Hartman's work and questions around what happens when you can't trace your ancestors through the archive that African American scholars were up against. And I started to think about what happens when our bodies are put into this archival record that is built on our genocide, right? That is built on enslavement, that is built on genocide, and the collection compression of the colonial archive. And I have, my own definition that I've developed of that process. I think of the compression of the colonial archive as being compressed under the gaze and the pen of the colonizer, to make Indigenous life known through collection, data, and description, and to make wealth of knowledge, of land, of water, of bodies and cultures for colonial possession. And so by this research, Indigenous peoples were compressed to make diamonds for the colonial gaze, just like, a little bit of coal that just got smushed and smushed. And thinking about this question of repatriation futures, I think about how that collection compression also compresses our narratives to fit with the colonial project. And particularly in my research, I was looking at this situation of tribal termination and how if I was very hesitant to use the colonial archive where this was traced because this archive was developed around extracting our land, extracting the river, and throwing us away, right? Getting rid of us. And I was concerned around how some of the folks in the community look at those records as the things that we need in order to get recognized, in order to get tribal enrollment, and how much of the archival process was to compress us into a carbon copy of the colonial nation, right? And if you think about 1934 Indian Reorganization Act, it does that, the sovereignty is sort of reformed to think about tribal nations as little US nations, reproducing the nation state in that way, and reproducing the nation state for extraction of our lands. And I was trying to think about, are there other ways to deal with that archive that don't do that, right? That don't compress us back into that box. And that's where I came to this question of fugitivity. I was interested in all of the ways that our ancestors had avoided containment, the ways that they avoided boarding school, they avoided dealing with the reservation, the ways they ran away from the reservation, ran away from the boarding school. and those escape methods as a different narrative of our history. And that is a different thing that could be traced through the archive, instead of trying to contain ourselves into the narrative of disappearance, but rather to explore the narrative of escape. And so that is the project that I'm working on. But back to the class. As I taught these different archival methods to students, what really stood out to folks was this issue of physical human bodies in institutions, in museums. And it made me think I need to learn more about that work. I need to understand it. And so I was introduced to some friends on the East Coast who were developing a project called Finding Ceremony that was supporting in African American community in Philadelphia with reclaiming ancestors from the Penn Museum, and ancestors who had been enslaved and then, put into this eugenics museum. And what was so amazing about that work was that it was led by the descendant community through this very strict guideline that we want to find ceremony for these ancestors. We want to find healing for our community. We want to bring them home in a respectful way. And so all of us researchers are doing archival work and genealogical work, but with the intention of ceremony. And we can talk about this in the Q&A, but Penn Museum was not a good player. They're kind of the case study of what not to do when it comes to repatriation. But I met a lot of amazing people who were committed to this quest for ceremony and healing, not only for Indigenous folks and for Afro-Indigenous folks on the East Coast, because of course we found that Penn Museum was trying to bury a Lenape person in violation of NAGPRA, things like that. But also asking this question of, for ancestors who were part of chattel slavery, where is the ceremony for them? Can we develop something like NAGPRA for African American communities as well? And so through that process, I met another O'odham person randomly who was, and part of my position as the descendant in the archive is that I think our ancestors work through that process. And so, of course, in this process, I met another O'odham person who was a NAGPRA officer for one of the reservations. And she said, do you know that UC Berkeley has some of your ancestors from Yuma? You need to go up there and look at them, particularly because you work at University of California. And so I've been involved in this process with our community of thinking about how do we navigate now, University of California, having our ancestors. But I do think that it was the ancestors themselves intervening to make that introduction. And so I think about how, just trying to find a pedagogy and a methodology brought me to the concrete work, brought me into these ceremonial processes as a gift from our ancestors, but also that it kind of brings me to this question of futurity. Again, I'm trying to think about our methods and how do they not reproduce the forces of genocide and extraction that got us here, but how can our methods open other possibilities for different paths into the future, for regeneration of our communities, for healing, for ceremony. And so I will leave it there, but very honored to be in conversation with all of you about this.
No, everybody. Anyway, turahe wekitu deriku. Good to see you. My name is Walter Echohawk. My coming in. Oh, okay, there. Yes, my Pawnee name is Rusa Turahe, which means good horse, and I belong to the Kitkahaki or Little Earth Lodge band of the Pawnee Nation. And through my grandmother's side, I belong to the Buffalo clan of the Oto tribe. Really glad to be here, and I want to thank Professor Johnson and the CAPS Center, as well as the Luce Foundation, for bringing us all together. Today, it's true, we do live in very testing times in the current political environment with all of these assaults that we see on our democratic norms and institutions, makes us wonder about our future. And I know in Indian country, the future of our tribal sovereignty, our tribal rights, and our tribal interests. How are we going to weather the storm, I guess, is on the mind of a lot of our tribal leaders. But here on campus at the UC of Santa Barbara, we can see a real meaningful opportunity to make some social changes here on the campus, through the efforts to develop this repatriation program in partnership with the local tribes here. And I'm really glad to be a small part of this very historic initiative because I think that the opportunity to make meaningful social change only comes along once in a great while, in the course of one's life. And when that opportunity comes our way, I think it's important to act, to do the right thing. And as I think was mentioned by Professor Johnson, change is in the air here on campus, and that's a good thing to see in the repatriation work here by the college, as well as around the country. We can see this active repatriation work is going on despite the current political moment. And it's been my experience in dealing with repatriation issues since the 1980s that for one thing, repatriation work is human rights work as defined by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And this NAGPRA, or Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, is a human rights law, according to Senator Daniel Inouye, one of the sponsors of that historic landmark national legislation. This work is also heavily imbued with the spiritual dimension as well, as was mentioned, because it involves the souls of our dead ancestors that have been disturbed through grave robbing, and the efforts to return them and reunite them, lay them back to rest. These are deeply spiritual matters for all peoples, I think, across the country, because awe towards the dead and death and burial has always stirred our human race, no matter what age and race or country or culture you come from, around the world. And I think that those who work in the area of repatriation they enter the spiritual dimension with one foot in the spirit world, one foot in the real world that we live in here as well. Also, this kind of work, repatriation work that the university is engaged in, can also bring about restorative justice, to bring us to those unforgettable moments when we see justice at hand, through the restoration of these human remains back to their peoples so they can be once again laid to rest. And so this is the kind of work in the restorative justice field that can heal wounds from a painful past if done in a certain way. And I think that this is of interest to the CAP Center to see that this work possibly can do that, to be a tool towards restorative justice, but so we can come to terms with our native people, come to terms with the history of genocide that took place here in California try to make things right to the best that we can. And so we look around the country today, even in today's testing times in the current political environment, but we see a national effort to implement these repatriation laws. Each tribe across the country has their own repatriation office, working day in and day out to implement this law, even 35 years after its passage. I know last week my own Pawnee tribe, we laid to rest over 2,000 human remains in the largest repatriation that we've done since 1990. That work is going on here on this campus as well. So this is a national human rights effort, imbued, as I mentioned, in the spiritual dimension. And I hope it can be done in a good way to bring about restorative justice, because sometimes it's the process followed that is more important than the end result, you know. And we do this because we want to do it, because of ethical considerations, and possibly to bring about a measure of restorative justice, you know. And indeed, I think that we can look around the world today to, there's a ongoing international museum movement into the ethical realm of repatriation in this museum ethical returns movement. It's sweeping across Europe and even here into our own country. The Smithsonian Institution, our leading museum in the nation, has adopted this ethical returns policy in the year 2022 to go beyond the law into the ethical realm and return objects based upon ethical considerations. And I think that this campus can do the same thing. There's nothing in NAGPRA that prevents voluntary remains, not because the law requires it, but because it's the right thing to do. And we see that movement sweeping the museum world. And it's important that Santa Barbara here at our campus do this with that kind of a heart in mind, not to be drugged, kicking and screaming, the last institution in the country to do this, but to do it, to join this ethical museum movement and take a step beyond the legal requirements into the ethical realm here. And just to close, I wanted to mention briefly the subject of our panel is Indigenous religious traditions and the law in this uncertain political environment. And on that regard, I just wanted to mention that it seems to me that there is a strong revival going along that's been over the past few decades in terms of strengthening indigenous or tribal traditional religious traditions. I know that's true in my Pawnee tribe and other places that our religious traditions are alive and well today. At one point they were banned, they were outlawed, they had to be practiced underground. But I know that today where I live and where I come from in Oklahoma, we have our language program in full sway. We have not a week or a month goes by to where we don't have our dances, sing our songs, and have religious ceremonies. I know just this upcoming month in November, we'll be holding our Young Dog Dance, a Sakipiti Idu. It has to do with our relationship to the animals. We'll be holding it. We have a hand game scheduled with one of our neighboring tribes. We'll be holding our Veterans Day dance, on the 12th of. So it's just sort of a robust. Cultures are alive and well, and these religious traditions really are a part of each tribal nation's cultural sovereignty. And this cultural sovereignty is defined internally, whereas, federal Indian law defines our political rights externally, but our cultural sovereignty is found by simply looking within to the heritage that was left to us by our ancestors, our languages, our songs, our ceremonies, hunting, fishing, and gathering ways of life, our art, our origin stories. This is a body of indigenous knowledge that we have inherited as our legacy. In historical times, it's also been, this cultural sovereignty has been our safe haven in difficult times in Indian Native American history in the United States when we lived under oppression. This was all we had, was our cultural heritage to be the glue that held our people together, and it still holds us together, gives us the will to survive as indigenous peoples with our cultures intact. And in my view, from my seat, it's still alive and well today, regardless of what's going on in the current political environment. I know that our legal rights as Native people, which are defined under federal Indian law, we have inherent tribal sovereignty. We exist in the domestic political system as domestic dependent nations with a government to government and nation to nation relationship with the United States government. We have a protectorate trust relationship between our tribal nations in the political system, in which the federal government is obligated to protect the best interest as our trustee of our tribal nations. This body of federal law and policy is tethered to the federal government, to our U.S. Constitution, our federal body of law. And so we have to be concerned about the health of our democracy, our tribal leaders. We can't be concerned only with our internal self-government affairs and nothing more. But we have to pay attention to these larger assaults on our democratic norms and institutions, because our federal Indian law is tethered to that, to our democracy. Should it slide into an authoritarian regime, our rights could crumble. And I don't think that culturally distinct minorities ever fare very well under dictatorships either, So we have an interest in Indian country along with the rest of our nation, to look out after the health of our democracy, even though our rights are ongoing as far as repatriation and our religious traditions are being carried out. So that's all I wanted to say. Again, thank you very much.
That's all he wanted to say. Kasalalia Mankov, ite Vicente Diaz, an panene ponpe con Kauson Paukalo, a big boulder that our family identifies with in Micronesia. In the audience, how many of you, raise your hands, are students? That's so awesome. Grad students. So I'm going to not that I don't care about the rest of you, And I'm going to say, I'm going to speak very deliberately and intentionally from the vantage point of being in Native studies in particular. And by Native studies, I mean American Indian and Native Americans studies, but also how Native studies elsewhere, in my case, Pacific Islands, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, the Samoa, Guam, is taking root here in Turtle Island, and how American Indian and Indigenous studies researchers, academics, and students are also increasingly reading work coming out of places like the Pacific Ocean. I'm going to preface what I have to say with a couple of things, and this is directed, everything I'm saying is directed to you students and graduate students. First of all, I don't know if I want to be an academic. And I got to figure that out before I retire. I tell that to the graduate students. And I'm not just being facetious here. If I have been able to do anything of value in academia for my communities and for Native studies, it will, I believe, have to do with the power of that ambivalence to carry me through, to keep things in their proper perspective. That's what I tell to the graduate students. To the undergraduate students, especially those of you who are worried about what you're going to major in, I don't know what I want to major in. And that's okay too. I ended up getting a degree in political science only because I had enough credits in that department to get the degree and stop having to pay tuition. But if I had the means to pay more tuition, I could have, in 1 to 2 more years, I could have gotten a degree in history and anthropology and Pacific Island studies. And that's pretty good for a guy who left my island to play football. You guys know that the majority of the Pacific Islanders men you find in university campuses are there for the football team, right? It doesn't mean we're dumb. We've been tracked in that direction. The point I'm making here is academia has become a very important canoe for me. And what I'm actually going to do is I want to talk about canoes and how a kind of theorizing and method for research and for teaching that's come out of Indigenous studies in the last decade or so, building on the significance of being good relatives, what has come to be called Indigenous relationalities, has not only been a very powerful workhorse, analytic workhorse in our field, I also think that it's one of the reasons why the best of work in Indigenous studies is being picked up outside of Indigenous studies by all the disciplines and increasingly in science. And that's because of the power that we're making of, well, first of all, that's because we've reached critical mass. When I began my career in academia, 30 plus years ago, any conference I'd go to in any discipline, you'd strain to find a Native person and maybe there might be 2 or 3 papers involving Native studies. Today we have a professional associations, actually several, that were founded by Native people in Turtle Island and Oceania, representing most of the disciplines. And we are seizing the terms of academic research. The other thing I wanted to say is it took me 30 years to refuse finally to compartmentalize the Native part of me from the academic part of me. They don't own what academia is supposed to stand for. And that's knowledge and the power that it is supposed to furnish for our societies. Long story short, canoe culture has been the place for me to learn and to recover our arts, our sciences, our humanities, our physical sciences. Can I have that slide, the first slide of the Pacific? So my part of the Pacific is in the far corner over there, Micronesia. Above the equator, you might be able to see Guam. You might see in big words, Federated States of Micronesia. My maternal lineage is to Pohnpei Island, but I grew up in Guam. Micronesia, most of you are familiar with Polynesia. Micronesia is these islands north of the equator towards the western part. Look for Yap, Guam, and Palau on the western side. And you can also see Marshall Islands right about over there, right? These would include the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of Palau, the Republic of the Marshall Islands. Maybe you heard some of these, maybe you didn't. I want to point out that from Guam and Yap and Palau on the west to the Marshall Islands alone is larger than the continental United States, that region. And if you add the Republic of Kiribati, which is spelled Kiribati, and Nauru below that, that island nation alone is almost the size of the continental United States. And probably its biggest island is probably like 2 square miles. In Oceania, we don't make hard lines between land, water. You cannot talk about land without talking about water very quickly. And you cannot talk about land, water, and sky. And land and water without talking about sky. And you cannot talk about land, water, and sky without talking about the people. You cannot talk about the people without talking about land, water, and sky. There's a relationality there, and it's one that is also mirrored in the relations that land, water, and sky have with each other and all other beings in there, both other than human, the flora, the fauna, the winged, the finned, but also who's known as the supernatural, the spirits. And so that way of thinking about who we are is even more specific. We are in relations of kinship. We understand who we are by way of understanding all of these as kin. Oftentimes it's the older relatives. The stars, for example, are our oldest relatives, right? Next slide. So the Pacific Ocean is so huge, you get a sense of just that slice of Micronesia being double the size of the continental United States. The Pacific Ocean, just remember that last map, that area is larger than the combined area of all the other continents and bodies of water. The Pacific Ocean alone is larger than that. This map shows the coincidence or the overlap of what's called Austronesian languages, the Micronesian, Melanesian, and Polynesian languages, with the exception of what's totally unceremoniously called the non-Austronesian languages, but the Austronesian languages, of which we're all a part. This map shows the spread of branches of the Austronesian language from island Southeast Asia and tribal Taiwan that you see disperses across all of the habitable Oceania, Pacific. But the spread of Austronesian languages goes the opposite direction as well. And so most of the indigenous languages of Madagascar over there off the east coast of Africa are Austronesian, but you'll find Austronesian speaking peoples in the east coast of Africa and also in pockets of South Asia, most of island Southeast Asia and tribal Taiwan. Austronesian-speaking people are outrigger, building, sailing people. That's the overlap. That's the coincidence of those two lines. It was the development of maritime technology that enabled people beginning 3,000 to 5,000 years ago to eventually fan out and settle, we might say speciate, right? This world that comes in my math through almost 4/5 of the globe's southern hemisphere. 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, we developed the maritime technology to do that and a knowledge of the environment around us to make effective and efficacious and powerful voyages. You do not do that without knowledge, without technology, without sophisticated science. These reflect a kind of cartography, a kind of meteorology, a kind of astronomy that we were never allowed to even acknowledge as legitimate. And one of the things that happened, one of the worst things that colonialism did, was to preempt the continued evolution and development of that kind of technology and that kind of knowledge system. Why? Because we were understood as primitive. No other reason than that. Okay. What does this have to do with the dilemma that we're at? This is one of the dilemmas that we're facing today. The political moment in which democracy is, Walter laid it out very, very poignantly, where democracy is at stake, and so is everything that we've come to gain from that, right? The dilemma is for every indigenous person that you might know that is opposed to MAGA America, there probably is at least another indigenous person supporting it. It's a very good chance that that other person belongs to the same family, if not the same community. And it isn't because they're stupid or they lack morals. I think when we're talking about indigenous people, investment in that, we can point to complicated histories of the entanglement between indigenous spirituality and religions and Christianity, such that that makes for a very powerful, potent, if conservative idea that bristles at what might be considered as the godlessness of liberalism and the hollowness and emptiness of consumer society. Christianity furnished a foundation. I'm not saying this simply as an advocate of that, actually. I think that that's something we just really have to deal with, right? Then there's indigenous traditions are also remarkably conservative and place a high value on authority and knowing your place, discipline, right? And to the extent that liberal political systems are seen as threatening or not knowing their proper place, you're going to see pushback against that. I think the idea of indigenous relationalities gives us, and I'll define that in a moment, but gives us the means to kind of bring them back into the fold. I don't mean to sound patronizing or chauvinistic, but I think my family members and my community that think that indigenous futures and values can be protected under this regime, I think they're wrong, and I think they're misguided. But I get it. I was also raised like that. And had I not gone to university and been introduced to Native studies, if I was successful in football, there's a really good chance I'll be on that side. Indigenous relationalities is the relations of kinship and reciprocity that Indigenous people famously have with the world around them, with everything in the world around them. But it isn't just that. It's the making good of the obligations and responsibilities to your ancestors and to your relations out there. The work of making good on that for all the Indigenous peoples that I'm aware of, is what comes to define what it means for them to be Indigenous. And here's where that becomes an important workhorse for political and cultural and historical analysis that has caught the attention of non-native scholars, like scientists, like social scientists, like humanities, art people. For almost all of us, our words in the vernacular for who we are is a version of the real human or the authentic human. In other words, it's relations of kinship and reciprocity with the world around us and making good on those obligations that comes to define what it means to be a human. And that also redefines how we understand nature. And of course, when you redefine what it means to be a human and what nature is, you're also redefining things like knowledge, like technology. I hope you can see how that offers an alternative to liberal rights discourse that's at stake and our histories that are also at stake in those systems. Thank you.
Thank you. You guys you're all amazing. That was wonderful and wide ranging. We have just about 15 minutes, so we'll take some questions and then please, if you can stick around for the reception, do, and we'll continue the conversation in that context. Dusty, are we going to take them here or? Yeah, so if you have questions, if you would come forward here and then use the mic because we're recording. Wish.
Great. Unmuted. Great. If you do have a question, please speak directly into the microphone.
It's taped. It's taped. Thank you all. Vicente, thank you very much. Thanks to everyone. So much food for thought. My question is about relationality. One of the elements of it, I'm curious about the relationship between relationality and humility.
Humility?
Yes.
Yeah.
And if you might want to, if maybe all of you could speak about the role that humility plays and why sometimes our knowledge practices, at least in the academy, sometimes lend themselves to feeling like we're being patronizing to others, when what we need to be doing is thinking about what we have to, not what we know, but what we have yet to learn from each other. Thank you.
Anybody want to take it up for? Because I can.
I can start. I can just say what I have learned in my research and in, just trying to go back to my community is that it's more important that I'm a dutiful daughter than I am a PhD or an academic or and so the question of, how are you getting along with your dad? and sometimes it's contentious, right? Is one that I wrestle with. But also that the way that I can do that most of the time is by listening. There's a lot of pieces of our history that I have gathered. There's a lot of information that I have access to. But one of the interesting things about our community is that the oral history is very complicated, and oftentimes people will have completely conflicting narratives about a historical event. And there are reasons why, and it comes down to some of the things that we've all mentioned about colonialism and, religious conversion and assimilation. And I am listening to those tensions, but I am never contradicting someone and saying your version is wrong because I found an archival document that says this, or because Auntie so-and-so says that. It's more just listening and thinking about what is the work that narrative is doing, and then asking more questions to figure out what is the work that narrative is doing. Where I do think it's important, so I think with dealing with our own communities, humility is very important. With dealing with institutions, that's when the city girl in me comes out, and I'm like, let me take off these earrings because I'm going to get chola with you. Give me my stuff back. And I don't have any humility with that. And that is what my community expects of me as well. And so I have many elders. I am often, I'm tired this week because just last week I had an elder messaging me on social media until like 2 a.m, telling me what I need to do. And being like, you better go over there and get our stuff back. We're counting on you to do it. And so I need to be very aggressive in those modes. And I think that there's just a time and a place, but that often comes back around to my duty, to the community, to my family. I don't know if that's the answer you were looking for, but.
When your arts and sciences and humanities is forged through thousands of years of relations, of kinship, and reciprocal relations with the world around you, when your knowledge system comes from that breeds a profound humility. When that produces a definition of what it means to be a human, that human doesn't brag as if it's exceptional. And it's actually the human. It's just where you take your proper place in the cosmos, right? We have a lot of religious studies folks here, right? Contrast that to the idea of monotheism and certain brands that teach us that there's one single creator that's omnipotent and almighty, but as images of that, we replicate that dominion on this earth. That's a very different kind of ontology, wouldn't you say? Yeah.
Anyone else on that question? No time for humility here.
I'll take a stab at it. Well, I think that's a good question. I know among my people, we're taught not to talk about ourselves. We're humble people, the common man, as you might say. But we also come from the warrior tradition in the Great Plains, and what it is to be a man, a protector, a provider. And for myself, some of the best, finest tribal leaders that I've worked with in my lengthy career, they were humble people. And I try to be that as best that I can, as well, learning from them. But at the same time, I'm trained as a litigator living in an adversarial lifestyle in that regard. But so I kind of walk a different line there, different path, as far as that's concerned. That's the only thought I have.
Our navigators are the models of that humility.
Let's take one more, and then let's take questions over, one-on-one over at the reception. But we'll take a question from Miriam, please.
Hi, thank you so much for your really, really valuable just insights on these really difficult topics. I had a question specifically about this administration and how it's impacting your work, specifically either in your communities or in institutions like UCSB, or even in your work as a scholar. If it's, I imagine, yeah, I'll let you answer the question. Thank you.
So I know for us, so a lot of the work that I do is NAGPRA related, and so a lot of times either the tribe I work for or the institution, we depend on a lot of repatriation grants. And I know we just got a repatriation grant. I don't know if this might be our last repatriation grant. So I'm gonna have to make this money really spread. And also to see if the other institutions, if they have money that can offset, some of this work that we're doing. I do know that some of our TIPA work, like we've submitted applications, we haven't heard back on many of the funding. So a lot of times, so right now, as far as funding, we're the tribes, we're depending on that funding source. If it doesn't, then that then goes back to the institutions, or that goes back to the tribe to foot some of this bill to get these ancestors and their things or these other cultural material things home. So for us, it's I feel like we are definitely, are we looking at some of the last lifelines of what some of the money that we can get to do this work? Maybe, and some of our other, like the historic preservation work, we haven't even gotten funding for that yet. And, and this again, puts more pressure on some of these other institutions and these other funding sources and getting creative. How can we get help? Because a lot of times our ancestors aren't just down the street. They are, I'm going to be doing a road trip from the East Coast, in the spring, as soon as there's no tornadoes. I'm going to be doing that, and that requires money. And so I know for us, we're scared. And that's not, funding is not even, I shouldn't even be worried about funding. We should be worried about our sovereignty. We should be worrying about these other bigger fish that are sizzling right now.
I mean, really quickly, yeah, I had applied for an NEH grant for historical research for our community. I got many meetings with them, lots of feedback. It looked like it was going to go through. And then a lot of this funding was pulled, and the NEH was redirected towards projects that are not critical of colonialism, very explicitly. So that grant is gone. And it was an interesting thing to sort of sit in as well, because part of that project was going to be partnering with local museums and tourist sites in Yuma around incorporating the indigenous history of the region. And those sites are predominantly catering to a Wild West sort of probably pro-MAGA audience that had been open to including our history up until this moment. And so it's an interesting thing to think about. How do we talk to those folks? How do we still do that historical work and update some of these incorrect and problematic museum and tourist sites? But I think there's, for our specific region, the issue right now is really around the water of the Colorado River and the Gila River, and what is going to happen with AI and the extraction of the water as it's intensifying, as people are, claiming that our river systems are dying, are dead, and what does that mean for us? And so I think that there's like serious ecological crisis that is a little bit more pressing. But I think for our community, because we're not federally recognized, it's a complicated moment as well. I think there's, there had been folks within the community advocating for pursuing, revisiting the tribal termination, seeing if there was an opening for reopening the question of federal recognition, and that is closed now. And so now we need to think about, what do we do beyond recognition? How do we work with our sister tribes that are recognized? And how do we sort of navigate the ecological crisis together that we're all about to go into, or have been really since the 1870s? But so I don't know. I think in the long span of time, because I look at historical work, this in many ways is just revisiting the 1800s for us. And so I'm looking at the lessons that we learned from that moment.
Thank you, Amra. President Echohawk, would you like to close us out with a final word?
Yes, I'd just like to say that there's 575 federally recognized tribes in the United States that are deeply embedded in our domestic political system, that our tribal sovereignty is deeply embedded in federal Indian law by hundreds of treaties, 374 treaties, thousands of federal laws, numerous Supreme Court decisions, thousands of federal policies and agency policies. And I don't see any effort right now to under the current administration to attack the underpinnings of that tribal sovereignty and also the federal government's tribal government status of our tribal nations. But it is troubling. I think I see a lot of, mainly it's collateral damage at the current time going on as far as cuts to our tribal colleges and staff and that sort of thing. And these are big problems, to be sure, but I think that they're more short-term challenges that we'll be able to weather the storm. We're still open for business, whereas the federal government's been closed for 5-6 weeks, shut down, complete shutdown. I know in Oklahoma we have 39 federally recognized tribes. They're all open for business and operating, and so hopefully we can weather the storm. But as I say, it's very troubling to see these assaults on our democratic institutions, because we are tethered, whether we like it or not, to this democracy.
Thank you.
And so that's all I do.
I love the note of open for business. That contrast is amazing. And also open for business is the reception next door. Come hang out with us. Thank our guests. It was really great to have you here.